If you're an HR benefits consultant right now working for a company, if you manage HR, if you manage insurance benefits, you have to be immersing yourself in AI. It's going to be a part of every product that you add to your employees in the future. So, today, what I thought I would do is give you a little bit of a framework of how I evaluate companies when they are looking to be a solution in benefits, particularly related to AI. I'm going to introduce you to some terminology. I'm going to give you some ideas and even personal experience about what I think you should be focusing on. So let's jump over to my desktop and I'll show you what I'm talking about. There are just some fundamentals you need to learn. And certainly, I always encourage people to start using AI themselves personally. Sign up for ChatGPT, start to experience what these models are like, and you will get a little bit of an understanding. Probably not enough from that to make AI decisions related to benefits, but I still want you to have a little bit of an understanding. So sign up, personally use these in your daily work. Start to learn how they are, used and understand exactly how they work. See an example of the outputs. The more personally you become invested in learning AI, the easier it will be to do that for your business and for your employer. Now, I'm going to introduce you today to maybe some big terms, and one of them is going to be this concept of deterministic versus non-deterministic. Of all the things that I see in HR benefits today where there's more confusion, it is how to position these products with the historical references of products you've used before. And so this is actually how this works. And I really want you to understand it because it forms the basic primary understanding of how you really need to evaluate these tools going forward. So, what does it mean to be deterministic versus non deterministic? Okay. All of the systems you've probably ever used in HR before have been deterministic models. These have been algorithms, could have been software, could have been flowcharts. It doesn't really matter. But basically, there was a question. The question would get an answer. The answer would maybe fall into a category. It could be yes, no, or not defined. And based on that answer, it would go to another solution. So it would be a pretty logical flow. And so you got very deterministic in how those outputs would be. So, for instance, if somebody had a hemoglobin A1C that was above 6 or 7, it might give a different outcome or a different recommendation. Very deterministic. They're very rule based and predictable outputs. They're often hard to program because you have to think of all of the inputs and all of the scenarios that you could possibly think of with a patient, but you always get the same input, always producing the same output. And that's a key component of existing systems. And that's typically where your brain is going to be in the HR benefit space when you start to think about models. But the problem with these, and you can quickly see, is that there's limited ability to handle complex situations. And in healthcare today, virtually every patient, every employee is complicated. This is not an easy world we live in today. There's way too many recommendations, there's way too many opportunities. And so before you know it, these kind of systems tend to either break or they lose some of their functionality because they're just not complicated enough to be able to handle the complicated scenarios. So that's where AI solutions can really shine. These are non deterministic models. So they use machine learning to help evaluate a whole context of information to be able to give an output. So they often don't rely necessarily on knowing every input. The systems are able to come up with a statistically relevant output. Now, the key point here is it's kind of statistically relevant, which means that although it can analyze this complex information, it can produce different responses related to the same problem. And that can be a little unnerving, particularly in the HR world, because it's not deterministic. These are non deterministic models, which means they have to be highly trained and there's got to be some post training on the models to make sure you get the results that you actually want. You also have to evaluate these models over time. At Rocket Tools, we do a whole lot of content generation, and we've seen it ourselves. One model will change. We didn't change the model, but maybe they released an update or they did something different at the large level, the OpenAI or ChatGPT level, and we get different outputs because it's not deterministic. You're getting a system that's sort of using like a brain, and it's thinking through these in this manner, and it's coming up with a different output. So as an HR professional that is used to having these deterministic models, It's really upon yourself to understand, to embrace this idea that there's going to be a lot of advantages here. But I think you can start to see some of the concerns, and you have to be knowledgeable about those and how you would address them. So, a little bit about large language models because you've heard about this before. So, some of the key applications that you see are just like writing clinical notes, summarizing things. I mean, that's why I really want you to get involved in ChatGPT and use it in your own work. Medical research interpretation. I hear this all the time that I just saw on LinkedIn, in fact, yesterday, that AI won't replace doctors. Okay, here's the problem. Doctors aren't available today, and patients today are actually using these models. I just had a friend of mine who got a genetic report back. She couldn't get in to see her doctor for a month related to the report, and she wanted to know what it meant. And I'm not sure the doctor could have completely explained it anyway. She literally took a picture of it. She put it in Perplexity, one of the AI models, and she got an interpretation of what that means. Now, was it accurate? I don't know the answer. Chances are it was probably pretty accurate. But I think you start to see what's going on here is even if you think you don't need to implement these systems, your employees and your patients are going to do that anyway. It's going to happen. Now, what are the challenges? Well, you may have heard of this word hallucinations, and I hear it all the time. In fact, it's often used as a buzzword for people who want to avoid touching AI. They say, oh, it hallucinates too much. First of all, that's not true. They do hallucinate, but they have gotten a lot better than they did when they were first launched a couple of years ago. The hallucinations are actually, to some degree, a lot less, but because they're rarer, you have to be more careful because you may not be on the lookout for them. But so they do occur. So, what's a hallucination? A hallucination is just frankly generating false information. Now, if you were like asking it to write a research paper, maybe if the research that it was referencing didn't exist, could actually make up a research paper to use as a reference. That's a really good example. So you have to be on the lookout for hallucinations and you have to test it to make sure it's not happening. It is something to be aware of. I don't think it's something to be scared of. The second thing is temporal bias. So what does that mean? Well, that's just using outdated knowledge. And you may have heard that some of the early ChatGPT models, particularly, were trained on data sets that ended at a certain time. So if you asked it who won the Super Bowl, it wasn't going to know the answer because it wasn't trained on that information. Now, there's been some solutions like Perplexity that have kind of solved that. But for the most part, you could have an outdated model or outdated information. But I will warn you about something else here. You can actually have a model that is trained on your data, but for some reason, if that data is constantly being generated, those answers are constantly being generated, it may lean toward giving the same kind of answer all the time. So it may not necessarily follow a consistent pattern, if you will. So you have to be kind of careful with temporal bias. I'll give you kind of a real world, kind of very practical advantage. You may know that AI can create images. So you can actually put in an image prompt that says, dog riding in a fire truck. You may not know it, but the words that are near the front of that prompt are going to be more prominent in the image. So in that example, a dog may actually be more prominent than the fire truck. That's an example, a very simple example of temporal bias, but that happens in healthcare. So imagine all of the data that's going on. It very well could be that it could tend to sway a certain direction, which may not necessarily be accurate and take into account all of the different and needed outcomes that a patient or an employee might need. And then finally, context collapse. So what's this? Well, many of these models may not necessarily take in the critical local elements. So if you've got certain geographies or certain racial ethnicities within your population, they may not necessarily be able to take in all of those intricacies as they give an answer. So it's something to kind of think about. Now, I've given you a little bit of intro, I've given you some concerns, but I want to talk about some advantages. The first one is going to be operational efficiency. If there's anything that AI can do, it can probably increase efficiency. It can make things go faster. They're so much easier to program. They're so much easier to put together. Often these systems are as simple as stringing together nodes, just bringing together things on a canvas and connecting them with a dot. That's how simple it is to sort of bring data into one solution into another. And so you can start to see when you think about the history of claims adjudication by big blues plans that these systems are often written in code that nobody's even born today that even remembers how they were programmed. And so You can see the advantages of using these kind of assistants to adjudicate claims, reduce processing time, shorten the time to get decision making to occur. So there could be some tremendous advantages there. How about fraud, waste, and abuse? If there was low hanging fruit in healthcare today, it's fraud, waste, and abuse. Being able to determine patterns is quicker and to do it soon and to be able to make those changes. So if you think about it today, when you're programming one of these big software systems to detect fraud and it costs $1 million to reprogram that system, you really have to have a pretty significant fraud before you can actually put in controls within that system. But imagine if you've got an AI model that's easy to program and learns over time and quickly can identify fraud. The really low hanging opportunity is to think about fraud, waste, and abuse. Also, administrative workflows and just kind of reducing overhead. Clinical decision support. So, one of the really cool things about AI is being able to risk stratify. If you start to think about the thousands of pieces of information from laboratory data to doctor visits to employee communications that happens on any given employee or patient, it is really hard to be able to stratify that patient. So, what's important, what's not? How do you evaluate that? And so, what happens in many systems, and don't tell me this doesn't happen in your company because I've been around too long, we do a little bit of peanut butter. We often send out these same communications to every patient or every employee. We often have the same programs offered to every employee. We just do the same thing because to break them down into categories is just too complicated. And programming those systems is just too difficult. AI can actually risk stratify people really easily, and it can take in that vast amount of information and help to create risk scores so you know who to go after and who not, where to put your marketing intensity and where not to worry about it. Those are just one good examples. Treatment recommendations that are actually based on evidence. So, I'm a doctor and I can tell you that my knowledge is up here. So when I see a problem, sometimes I actually go, well, that's the solution, but I may not have had the latest information that's available. So these kind of systems have the opportunity to bring in that latest research so that potentially a patient could have the best outcome, the best opportunities. Predictive analytics. So preventative healthcare is one of those things that many employers honestly don't like to invest in because the payoff is so far down the road, it's hard to see the one-to-one connection. So as long as it's cheap, employers will actually do it. But when it starts to become expensive, employers start to see, I'm not seeing the benefits for it. But what would happen if we could predict and use predictive analytics to know this particular measure would really pay off? Those are examples of the kind of thinking and learning that can come from AI. And then finally, we haven't even touched on this concept of ambient knowledge. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this only because it's something that most HR professionals are not aware of today. And it is something that is happening everywhere. It's probably happening to you today, but you probably never thought of it in the context of HR. So, what is ambient knowledge? Well, in the simple word, ambient knowledge is like having AI look over your shoulder or listen to your conversations. Think about Siri. How many times have you been in a house and you've had Siri on and you haven't been talking to Siri, but maybe you've been talking about something and before you know it, Meta is showing you ads based on what you saw. I'm not accusing Meta of listening to your house or anything like that, but I think we've all suspected that there is this ability to use ambient knowledge. So in a very simplistic way, that is ambient knowledge. Ambient knowledge are really AI-powered systems that capture real time, maybe clinician or patient or employee interactions, and then use that data and analyze it. Now, wait a minute. I'm sure immediately you're going to start to, based on just the conversations we've had in this PowerPoint already, you're going to step back and go, wait a minute, Dan, this sounds like with all what you told me, this could be very, very concerning. And it possibly could be. So think about it for just a minute. But I'm also going to show you some advantages related to this that we've never really tackled before because we haven't had the ability. But an example would be to automatically document encounters. And if you think about it, we record conversations today. So we often do that when somebody's talking to HR today, that conversation gets recorded so it can be referenced later. And you've all answered that question. This conversation may be recorded for customer service. All kinds of things like this happen today, but certainly they are a little bit more concerning when AI is actually doing the listening. But it could dramatically reduce the administrative burden. Let me show you a couple of real examples. This is from Google, and I just picked 3 Google products that they're working on that I'm pretty excited about. One of them is Contact Center AI, and this is really where The customer service agents are kind of whispering in the ear of a customer service professional. So let me show you how this works. So let's just say somebody calls in and they want something simple like a new ID card. Now, most customer service professionals would know how to do that. I'll talk about it in a minute why they might not, but let's just say most do. But that would listen to the conversation and it might whisper that is available on screen too in the top left corner. So all of a sudden, that agent, that real person, is actually empowered to know where that solution is on the screen. Now, I was just in a meeting recently and I asked this question like, what's the time tenure of an employee like 5 years ago in a customer service center? And it was often 5, 7, 8 years. Today, it's often counted in months because there's so much turnover in these customer service systems. So you can imagine training could be compressed, but quality could be actually enhanced with these systems. So when somebody's listening, like an AI system, and tells a brand new customer service agent where the solution is on a page, that employee could get the answer way faster and honestly way more accurate than they could in the old system. So that's one example. Customer Engagement Suite is another product they have. That's where there's advanced conversational agents. That's where you're talking to a chat bot and you're getting that kind of system. And then, of course, Gemini, just automating transcripts and that sort of thing. So we've talked a lot about the advantages here, and I've tried to paint a picture that there really is an advantage. And I don't know that we have an opportunity to push pause here. The genie is out of the bottle. So we're actually going to see AI go into many of the workplaces, and many of the solutions that we're already using are going to slap the word AI on there, and they're probably going to put some AI systems in place. So let's talk a little bit about the risk. Well, the first one we talked about was non-determinism. So understanding that you may not get the same consistent output every time. So you have to be aware of that. Very, very important. And the second thing is this concept of model drift, which means that the outputs could change over time. So let me go back to that beginning of this conversation. In the old days, you might put in place a flow or a system and you would test it. And if it worked, so if A plus B equals C, you really never had to worry about it very much. You were always going to end up with C. But with these AI systems, that may not be true. So you have to think about always doing some sort of continuous testing, doing some retraining, making sure these systems are actually working consistently over time. They are not a Ronco, set it as forget it. You actually do need to put them in place. I think they offer a lot of advantages, but you have to do continuous monitoring to make sure that these systems can give you the results that you need. Data security. This probably goes without saying, but certainly privacy and data security are important. Now, this is another example of where I talk to a lot of HR professionals. And if I talk about data security and AI, they all go, yeah, we know all that. But the one thing I really want to stress here is that it is really easy for the genie to get out of the bottle here. Meaning that once your data has been used to train a system, there's really no going back. You're not going to get your data back from that. So it's very, very important to put in place really good protection measures. I mean, obviously, things like end-to-end encryption and de-identification are very important. I want to mention something about federated learning because what happens sometimes is this data security question often causes people to be going, yeah, I know we've got systems in place, or they do just the opposite. So I've seen HR professionals go, we are never going there because it's too dangerous. We can't participate in these models. We can't share our data. Here's the thing. There are ways that you can participate in the models. And one of them is something called federated learning. I'm going to give you a very high flyover of this, but basically it's where you train a model on your data locally on your system, firewalled away from everybody else. But you share the best practices with a central server that aggregates the federated knowledge from a bunch of different other people doing the same thing. And you can get amazing results because you can share your outputs and your results without ever sharing the training on your data. It's called federated learning. It's just one of those words to write down. So when you're evaluating one of these solutions, you ask them, do you do federated learning? Do I have to give you my data? Is there a way that we can get that kind of output without me sharing all of our employee data with you? Because that may be something you don't want to do. So, what's the framework? How would you actually evaluate them? Well, the first thing I'm going to say is outcome focused metrics. That's very, very important. Measure outcomes, don't just measure efficiency. You're going to find almost every solution that knocks on your door or gets an appointment through a consultant. They're going to talk about efficiency because AI and efficiency improvement, it's actually pretty easy to create. But you don't want to make these decisions solely based on efficiency. There may be solutions out there where that's really important and that's the primary metric. But for the most part, you want to focus on healthcare outcomes because if you're not creating healthcare outcomes, then you're just creating an efficient way to not get outcomes. And I always recommend that this is the primary determinant of evaluating them. So evaluate the clinical metrics and the financial return at the same time and establish what this baseline is going to be before you start because it's really easy in AI models to sort of move the puck. So I always recommend if you're going to evaluate one of these new vendors, they're going to say, hey, we can improve your A1C from here to here. Okay, then write in a performance guarantee. Have them put a performance guarantee in that system to say, okay, if you can do that, you can consistently do it, then put it in writing. Because think about it. In a non-deterministic model, you may not have the line of sight on their outcomes. So put the onus on them to justify it and put it in writing and make it financially important. Transparency and explainability. So let me explain what this means. Really demand clear documentation of how the AI is making a decision. Now, I'm going to be fair to you. These systems are kind of neural programming. So sometimes when you ask ChatGPT to do something and it gives you an answer, it's really hard to know exactly how it came up with that answer. And that's part of both the beauty of these models and the challenge. Okay. Totally understand that. I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking a little bit more about if these AI systems are linked together in a flow, what is the flow? What is the data set that the AI model is trained on? So for instance, if back to that hemoglobin A1C example, if you ask AI to evaluate medical records and all this laboratory data and to come up with an answer related to diabetes, what criteria are they using to be able to make that evaluation? What database are they using? How often is that database updated? Ask those questions in advance so that you have a line of sight that it's not just a black box. Don't fall for this black box analogy, proprietary data analogy. You challenge them on how the AI is actually making the decisions. Secondly, make sure that the clinicians have a line of sight and that they can verify the actions. So what I mean by that is when you think about a logical flow where you have data, there's some algorithms, maybe there's some connection points and maybe another algorithm and another data connection point. Make sure your clinicians can see that entire flow, that they're not just dropping in data over here, 17 actions and getting an answer over here. You should understand how that happens over time. So your clinicians and the people that are evaluating these programs can see how the AI is making decisions at different points. We think of that as reasoning decisions, but think about that whole flow that you're not just seeing an input and an output. And then finally, ask the vendors to disclose how they trained the model. It's important for a couple of reasons. One, did they train it on current data? What's their approach to training it on new research and new data that comes out? They're probably going to learn something from working with other companies. So how does that get incorporated, including how does your data get incorporated? So ask that question up front so that you understand exactly how those models would be updated and what changes that you can expect. Reproducibility. This is another thing that when I'm talking to HR consultants, they're not really familiar with. So again, we've talked about this before, but you need to look for consistent performance across diverse populations. So testing of these models is a lot different than testing in the old days on more algorithmic or deterministic models. In the old days, again, you might run 100 claims through a system and you might declare victory. But in these models, it's way more complicated. There needs to be a whole lot of testing going on, and it needs to be continuous testing. I think in the future, testing models is going to become a business on its own related to healthcare. I think you're going to find companies that are just going to focus on testing the model. So if you put in a new AI system, they're going to come in and run maybe 1,000 tests, and maybe they're going to run 100 every month, or maybe even more than that, to verify that consistency of outputs over time. So the big thing here is make sure that you implement real world scenarios. They're complicated. We're challenging it with everything because those outputs are going to vary. Even if you put the same input, remember, you're going to get a different output potentially. So make sure that you test this multiple times for consistency and that you have processes in place for this reproducibility. governance of your data. We talked a little bit about this already, but establish upfront who owns your data. If you're comfortable sharing your data, then go for it. But honestly, my advice to you is be very protective of your data for a lot of reasons. Number one, it's your data. Number two, it's very sensitive data. But the other thing is, you may find that in this particular world, that the governments today may be okay with you sharing certain levels of data. But once you pull the genie out of the bottle and you put your data into these systems, there's no going back. You're not going to untrain a model from your data. It's gone. And in the future, I don't know what governments are going to do, but what happens in the future if all of a sudden there's a change in administration, a change in policy? You may find that that sort of liberal approach to data is not the same. So I'm kind of encouraging people to take a very cautious approach to sharing data. It's not that you don't do it, but I think you're very careful about doing it and you understand what the long-term ramifications of it are, and also very established rules related to the legal frameworks and what's allowed under HIPAA. And then finally, make sure there's a clear audit trail on what happens to that data so that you know that if this data goes here to here to here, that you can reproduce that in the future if somebody from the government knocks on your door and asks to help. So I've talked a lot about the risk. I don't want to scare you because I think it's really important for people to embrace AI. And I want to talk a little bit about what I think the final action steps are. So I'm going to make it really simple for you. Number one, prioritize solutions that give clinical outcomes and not just efficiency. Today in healthcare, and I've been doing this over 25 years, we need outcomes. Yes, efficiency would be great, but outcomes are really what we want. We've had too many systems out there in the past that have said, oh, we can engage with everyone. And so they've developed pretty efficient systems at doing engagement, as an example. We don't need that. We need outcomes. We need people to actually be better in their care, lower in their cost, and actually happier and healthier in their lives. So focus your solutions on determining what those outcomes are. Number two, go ahead today, even if you don't have an AI system, put in a robust governance framework and do that before you implement these models. Because again, once you've implemented them, once you've made some data sharing arrangements, once you've started to use these systems, you may not be able to turn back the clock. So it's very important to be thinking about how you're going to govern your data, how you're going to make decisions related to AI within your company, and do it before you actually ever implement a model. Now, I'm going to put a little stressor here. This is more complicated than it sounds because many of the systems that you already have in place, that you already have contracts in place, that you're already paying a PMPM for, they've got an AI strategy going on. So it's important that you look at all of your systems that you're using today and you start to overlay this new governance model on it. Don't just think that we've got a system in place and unless something changes, it doesn't matter. You have to be thinking those companies are probably implementing AI anyway. So you need to be proactive in thinking about governance. Only partner with vendors that are committed to transparency and validation. So if they're not going to be able to open up the kimono and tell you exactly how the system works, don't partner with them. Just say no. Okay. Now I'm going to add up another little kind of subcolon to this and say, also today, I would not partner with a vendor that doesn't have an AI strategy. So I'm not telling you to be overly cautious. I think you do need to be partnering with solutions that have an AI strategy. Just make sure that they're transparent and that you can validate the results. I would say, I'm on the record for saying this, I would not invest anything if I was an investor or a company today in a company that does not have a robust AI strategy. Stay away from those companies. The future is going to be the operational efficiency and outcomes related to AI. So embrace that. Just do it mindful that you need to have transparency and validation. And then finally, invest in education for your employees, for yourself, for the providers that may be doing care for you. Invest in that now. This systems is changing so fast. Every time I come to work and turn on my computer, there's a new model. Every week, you've probably seen the news. There's a brand new Chinese model, brand new OpenAI model, brand new Claude model, brand new Perplexity model. Every week, it seems like they are achieving benchmarks that were unprecedented a year ago and unheard of 5 years ago. So the point I'm trying to make is this is happening. So you need to be knowledgeable. How do I start? You start by just using basic tools in your workplace and your home. So get on ChatGPT, get on one of those systems and start engaging. Learn that it's not a Google search, that it's actually a conversational experience. Learn how they work, see the examples of the outputs that happen so that you have a little bit of that knowledge going in. And then at the same time, invest in educating the people that work for you. Put in education systems, talk about automation, talk about workflows, talk about the opportunities that large language models can bring to work outputs. Bring in people like me or other people to speak to these groups to talk about AI. Have an AI conversation within your company. Here's the thing. It's not just beneficial for HR. It's beneficial for product development, for innovation, for the changing framework of business today. Your competitors in the past, maybe they were 3% better than you were this year, and they had a little bit of an advantage. You went raise a little money, cut some budget costs, repositioned R&D, and you could catch up. Today, AI companies are often 1,000% better when they start to put in systems. So companies, to stay competitive, you need to be a part of this conversation. And that starts with starting using those tools yourself. If I can help you in any way and answer any questions, have any feedback on this PowerPoint, disagree with me, then send me an email. Happy to jump on a Zoom call and talk about AI and how it could be useful in your particular HR solution.